This is Paige Bolt's, Raphael Sharabani's, Chloe Azuelos, and Tyler Ardman's presentation on navigating identity through punk rock in the Buddha of suburbia. The central struggle in the Buddha of suburbia is fundamentally about identity, specifically Kareem's impossible position between two distinct worlds that seem incompatible. Kareem's British suburban identity and his Indian heritage inherited from his father create a painful tension where he feels pressured to choose one or reject the other entirely. This reflects a broader reality for second-generation immigrants in the 1970s England. Belonging to multiple cultures often means not fully belonging to any single one. The author presents identity as something fluid and evolving rather than fixed. As Kareem moves from the suburbs to London, his sense of self shifts with each new experience and encounter. The crucial revelation here is that punk rock culture becomes the space where Kareem can finally explore and express this conflicting identity without having to choose between his heritage and his individuality. By embracing punk, he seeks liberation from the restricted expectations that demand he be either authentically British or authentically Indian, but never both. The novel asks its central question: can Kareem construct a genuine self that integrates all aspects of his identity, or will external pressures force him to permanently deny fundamental parts of who he is? Slide 2. Rejection of Indian heritage. Initially, Kareem actively rejects his Indian roots by deliberately distancing himself from anything marking him as different from his middle-class British peers. His embarrassment becomes the driving force behind his attempt to construct an entirely British identity. This rejection is comprehensive, extending across fashion, language, values, and cultural practices as Kareem essentially attempts to perform whiteness and Britishness as though his Indian heritage were merely an embarrassing costume he could simply just remove. The novel makes clear, however, that this strategy stems not from Kareem's genuine personal convictions, but from internalized racism and the powerful structural social pressures of a society that privileges whiteness and marks his Indian identity as foreign, inferior, and intrinsically other. His shame about his background reflects systemic racism embedded in British society, rather than any actual flaw in his father or Indian culture. It's a wound inflicted by living as a systematically devalued minority. Here lies Qureshi's crucial irony. Kareem's pursuit of authentic punk rebellion paradoxically depends on profound inauthenticity about his own lived experience and actual identity. While punk claims to represent genuine self-expression and rejection of conformity, Kareem's embrace of punk, while denying his heritage, actually constitutes conformity to racist hierarchies, selecting only those aspects of himself that socially legitimizes while hiding those marked as other. This tragic juxtaposition reveals how even rebellion and alternative subcultures can perpetuate systemic racism and assimilationist ideology when constructed through denial. Ultimately, Kareem's heritage rejection represents the internalization of racism, demonstrating how powerful social pressures force young people to mutilate their identities in pursuit of belonging. Slide 3. Exploration through punk rock culture. What punk rock represents in Kareem's life is something revolutionary, a form of rebellion and authentic self-expression that feels genuinely liberating compared to the failed hippie idealism that dominated the previous generation. For Kareem, specifically, punk provides his escape route from suburban conformity and the inauthentic performances of his father's fake spiritual guru persona. The punk ethos, raw emotion, rejection of Polish, embrace of chaos and anger resonates with Kareem's generational frustration in ways that the commodified peace and love of hippies simply cannot satisfy. When Kareem encounters punk in its raw, unpolished form at a live performance, he feels genuine shock and recognizes something truly dangerous and outside the mainstream system of consumption. What punk offers Kareem that mainstream society cannot is a symbolic language to express his hybridity and in-betweenness, his fundamental sense of not fitting into predetermined categories. Punk's rejection of manufactured aesthetics in favor of authentic self-presentation speaks directly to Kareem's deepest need, to express his genuine feelings and actual identity without performing for anyone. In essence, punk becomes far more than music or fashion. It becomes the vehicle through which Kareem can finally honor all aspects of himself without compromise or denial. Slide 4. The consequences of denying your heritage. One of the novel's most powerful cautionary lessons emerges through Kareem's initial rejection of his Indian heritage and the severe psychological toll this denial exacts on his identity and well-being. Early in the narrative, Kareem experienced such acute embarrassment about his background that he desperately attempts to distance himself from anything foreign to fit into British society, and more specifically, into Charlie's social circle. This rejection manifests in concrete, destructive ways. He actively avoids family traditions, adopts exclusively British cultural references, and refuses to acknowledge his father's influence as a legitimate part of his identity. Yet, Qureshi makes abundantly clear that this strategy of cultural denial brings Kareem no satisfaction or genuine belonging. Instead, it creates persistent internal conflict and a deep sense of inauthenticity that corrodes his emotional well-being. Kareem experiences profound tension between the punk identity he has adopted and the family expectations rooted in his Indian background, leaving him perpetually caught between two worlds with no stable sense of self. The novel's argument is unsparing. Attempting to erase a fundamental part of your identity is both psychologically destructive and philosophically impossible. You cannot successfully deny what you fundamentally are without suffering severe emotional consequences. His constant sense of disconnection and feeling out of place intensifies precisely because he's living inauthentically, denying rather than integrating his actual background and lived experience. This suggests punk's promise of liberation becomes empty when that liberation depends on denying who you actually are. Slide 5. Kareem's integration and growth. As Kareem engages with punk culture over time, something profound happens. He begins to understand that authentic identity doesn't require choosing between his heritage and his chosen subculture. He can synthesize both. The turning point becomes when Kareem stops viewing his Indian heritage as embarrassing baggage to discard and instead recognizes it as legitimate and valuable part of his complete self. This psychological breakthrough is enabled by punk itself, which emphasizes individualism and self-determination, empowering him to claim both identities simultaneously rather than enforcing an impossible choice. Through this ongoing immersion in punk and sincere reflection on his life, Kareem discovers an authentic identity that genuinely belongs to him, one that reflects his real lived experience as someone who inherently belongs to multiple cultures and traditions. His personal growth manifests in growing artistic confidence and ambitions, reveal that accepting one's complete identity actually enables creative flourishing rather than limiting it. As Kareem reconnects with his family and deliberately incorporates his cultural roots into his self-expression, he moves beyond the reactionary rebellion that initially attracted him and toward a more mature, integrated sense of self. Qureshi's insight here is clear. Authentic identity formation doesn't mean rejecting what makes you different. It means thoughtfully integrating all aspects of yourself with your chosen affiliations and genuine beliefs.
Hello everyone, today I'll be talking about commodification of rebellion and art in Hanif Qureshi's The Buddah Suburbia, using rocking London youth culture as commodity, the essay by Berkham Direnchi Seglam. So, basically the essay talks about is every youth rebellion has two possible endings. You can say small and hidden, that way you can keep your real meaning, but you can stay powerless and nobody cares. Or you become popular. And the second that happens, the system turns you into something to buy and sell, like a commodity that the essay talks about. Hippies, punks, or those types of rebellions, they all end in the same way. The system just swallows them up and spits them back out as fashion, music, or theater tickets, just like an old era. And at the end of the day, nothing in society actually changes. So, here we talk about Charlie and how he became in his punk phase. The novel shows this perfectly with Charlie and the punk. Kareem and Charlie walk into a tiny South London club and see real punk. Angry working class kids, safety pins through their faces, spitting on the stage, shouting about hate. It's scary, it's raw, and it's dangerous. Charlie is blown away. He literally says this in the future. He literally says this is the future. But what does he do? He doesn't join them. He copies the look, cleans it up, changes his name to Charlie Hero, puts on a fake tough guy accent, and starts playing huge stadiums in America. A real rebellion that started in a dirty club ends up as a big money-making product. That's the commodification in action. So here, we'll be talking about Kareem and the theater. So it's basically exactly the same thing that happened. He thinks acting is going to make him free and let him be his true self. His first big role was Mowgli in the Jungle Book. He was dressed as an Indian man, and people were making fun of him for his Indian. He had to paint his face darker and speak with a silly Indian accent just because he's brown, and he uses that persona to make him more popular and to fit in. His real mixed race identity gets turned into exotic entertainment for a white audience who pays to see something different, something that's not Hollywood. Later, he plays angry rebel characters on stage, but the audience just claps, pays, and goes home. Nothing in the real world changes. Rebellion that could be dangerous becomes safe, paid for theater tickets. And over here, we see that there are no hippies left by the end of the novel. It's just gone. It's the end of an era. At the end of the novel, there are no hippies or punks left anywhere in London. Everyone has short hair, smart clothes. The whole thing lasted a couple of years. Both movements disappeared the moment they became visible, because London turned them into fashion, concerts, and plays, which made them very diverse. The city just swallowed the real rebellions and moved on. So here's the huge question the book and the essay leaves us with. If everything we do to rebel, music, clothes, theater, just gets packaged and sold the second it gets famous, can any real rebellion actually ever win? I don't think so, and that's the scary part.
Matches the essay's argument. Punk rebels against hippies by using new symbols, but at the end of the path, both rebellions get absorbed into mainstream culture. In the novel, the suburbanites use Indianness as a rebellion, but only as a style. They aren't breaking any boundaries, they're just decorating the boundaries they already live in with Eastern imagery. And Kareem sees all of this happening, which shapes his discomfort with his own identity. What really stands out is who controls the meaning. Indian culture becomes fashionable only when white people decide it's interesting. Haroon doesn't get to define himself. Other peoples do it for him. Eva controls the frame. She decides when Haroon performs, how he performs, and how his Indianness gets presented. The guests decide what part of his culture are worth paying attention to, and which parts are too real or too uncomfortable. Kareem is very aware of this. He watches his father become a kind of spiritual prop, and it teaches him that racial identity isn't neutral. It's shaped by the expectations of the people in power. Even when people admire Indian culture, they admire the parts that fit their fantasy, not the actual lived experience. So the exotism looks like respect, but underneath, it reinforces the same hierarchy. The consumers have power and the performers don't. And that's exactly how cultural tourism functions. What I appreciate about Qureshi, though, is that he complicates this dynamic. Haroon isn't just a victim. Sometimes he genuinely enjoys the attention. He likes the status, the mystery, and the excitement of being admired by people who used to ignore him. He even uses the performance to get closer to Eva. So the situation is not black and white. Harun is being exoticized, but he's also participating. He's navigating the limited power he has in the only ways available to him. Still, the larger message remains clear. When culture becomes a trend, the people inside that culture lose control over their identity. What gets celebrated is not the real history or real experience, but a simplified, aesthetic version of it. That's why Qureshi's critique is so strong. He shows that cultural tourism feels harmless, even flattering on the surface, but underneath, it turns people into symbols and turns difference into entertainment. And once that happens, no one's identity is truly being respected.
Identity becomes performance. The final section of the essay, Rocking London, Youth Culture as Commodity in the Buddha of Suburbia, argues that in a highly commercialized society, identity itself becomes a kind of product. The essay starts by showing how London's youth culture turns every form of rebellion into something you can buy: punk jackets, spiritual accessories, political badges. But it ends by suggesting something even more personal and more troubling. Young people end up marketing themselves. The self becomes a performance, something shaped to fit what society rewards. The essay describes how young people in the 1970s adopted different roles depending on what seemed fashionable or socially valuable. Being radical, being exotic, being artistic, being cool. Each of these roles was enforced by cultural industries. The essay argues that youth culture ended up rewarding performance rather than authenticity. Kareem's shifting identity. This is where the essay connects most powerfully to the Buddha of Suburbia. Because Kareem is not just moving through cultural scenes, he's constantly adapting himself, reshaping himself, performing different versions of who he might be. And this is precisely what we see with Kareem throughout the novel. He's not simply figuring out who he is, he is learning which selves are useful. When he enters the theater world, for instance, he quickly realizes that the version of himself that gets attention is the ethnic one. Instead of resisting this, he adapts to it, not because he likes it, but because it is the identity the industry wants to buy from him. That is the point of the essay. The market shapes which identities are rewarded, and young people respond accordingly. At one moment in the novel, Kareem reflects that London gave him too many choices, and he begins to feel lost in the multiplicity of possibilities. The essay suggests that this reflects a consumer society, where identity becomes a series of options, each encoded with commercial meaning. Kareem adopts new accents depending on his environment, more posh with theater actors, more South London with his working class friends. He switches clothes and attitudes to fit different cultural spaces. The essay argues that this fluidity is connected to commodification. When everything, including rebellion, becomes style, identity loses its anchor. In this sense, the novel dramatizes a world where authenticity becomes difficult to locate, not because people lie, but because the available roles are already commodified. This connects to the essay's claim that identity must be displayed, marketed, and recognized by others. Young people adopt identities the way that they adopt brands. Is authenticity even possible? Kareem's situation is more complex. As a mixed-race young man, his identity is already mediated by how others see him. When the world reads him as exotic, but the novel also shows that the performance can be a strategy for survival. Kareem's shifting identities aren't signs of inauthenticity, they are tools. He navigates a London that commodifies him, and performance gives him access to art, culture, and social mobility. In this way, the novel complicates the essay's pessimism. While the essay emphasizes the loss of authenticity, the novel suggests identity performance can also be creative, a form of agency. Still, the truth remains. Kareem's identity is shaped by what the culture is willing to purchase. So, the ultimate question is, if identity is shaped by cultural and commercial pressures, is authenticity even still possible? Or is the modern self always, in some way, a product? Nat, where did you put it? Which room is it in?
It's not there, but you're just stupid for having spoken. What if it's not done?
It doesn't matter, it's done. You don't hear it